Good afternoon, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute. You have joined us for an introduction to careers in environmental law and policy. My name is Caitlin McCarthy, and I am the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at ELI. We're delighted to welcome everyone to the very first seminar kicking off ELI's annual summer school series, and I encourage you to join us here at ELI every Tuesday for summer school. For more information, please see the events page of our website, eli.org. I will note that every summer school seminar this summer will be taking place by webinar only to make sure that we can keep our panelists, participants, and staff safe. Thank you for your understanding and for joining us in this format. At the end of today's panel, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to summer school. While I will introduce them briefly momentarily, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. Linda Abbott is the Director of the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost-Benefit Analysis for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In this role, she coordinates the review of regulatory risk assessments and cost-benefit analyses for major USDA proposed rules affecting the environment, human health, or human safety. Linda, thank you for joining us. Lisa Garrett is an associate at Akin Gump, where she assists energy clients in connection with strategic transactions. Lisa, we are so glad to have you on summer school faculty. Marc Goncher will be joining us momentarily. He is the Counsel for Environmental Safety and Sustainability at the Coca-Cola Company. He is a strategic and solution-oriented attorney who leverages broad legal experience with solid business acumen to develop and implement strategies that align with corporate objectives, insurance compliance, and to mitigate risk. Alejandra Goyenechea is Senior International Counsel at Defenders of Wildlife. Her primary focus is in CITES, CMS, RFMOs, wildlife trafficking, and other international wildlife conservation issues, with an emphasis on Latin America. Alejandra, we so appreciate you joining us. Hanna Vizcarra is a staff attorney for the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. She leads the Environmental and Energy Law Program's portfolio on private sector approaches to climate and environmental issues. Hanna, thank you so much for being here. And Alexandra Wyatt is the Policy and Regulatory Manager of Grid Alternatives. She leads Grid's advocacy and regulatory efforts to assure equitable expansion of the clean energy economy with a focus on the Mid-Atlantic states. Andy, thank you for joining us. So as you can see, we have a really fantastic panelist today with a wonderful variety of backgrounds, experiences, and expertise. Thank you all for kicking off the 2020 Summer School Series. With that, I would like to warmly turn things over to Linda to get us started.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Oh, excellent. First, I'd like to thank ELI for inviting me to be on this panel. I mean, I am very honored to be on this panel because I think I have a very different path to the law than my colleagues have. As I was planning on as I was making this presentation, when we discussed it originally, I was going to focus on my current job, which I'm still going to tell you about, but I realized as I started writing everything down that one of the themes of my story is you may have many different jobs, many different careers, many different career paths, but you can mold them together such that each preceding job strengthens and adds a new dimension to your present career. And I think that's probably what I am an example of. I'm definitely now in the latter part of my career, as I'm soon going to have 30 years in the US government this November. I can remember the first Earth Day. In fact, I remember sitting on the edge of my seat in junior high as a speaker from the Philadelphia National Academy of Sciences showed us slides of water pollution in our own backyard. And I was really taken with this because he was emphasizing the role of nutrients on creating algal mats, something that I was very familiar with from going down to the creek in the back of my yard. There were algal mats everywhere. I don't know how much this speech influenced me, but as I was writing what I'd done in my life, I think it probably had a much bigger impact on me than I believed. I remember the first thing I did was when I came home from school that day, I told my parents, we've got to stop using the laundry detergent you're using, and you've got to stop buying that colored toilet paper. But eventually, I found myself in an ecology program. I was very interested in ecology first. After I graduated from college, I had two twin thoughts. One was going to law school, and one was pursuing a career in ecology. The thing that was keeping me from pursuing the ecological career was there didn't seem to be any jobs except for people who were in academia. I had an internship with the National Wildlife Federation where the naturalist at the Wildlife Federation was the tipping point, and he was encouraging me to go to grad school, not to law school. So I ended up in grad school, and I started at George Mason University. I got my master's there. I ended up getting my first federal job while I was getting my master's there. I started with the Environmental Protection Agency a long time ago, where I was looking at Superfund sites all over the country using historical aerial imagery to try and see where hazardous waste had been buried and forgotten about long ago. I got into the George Mason doctoral program in environmental biology and public policy. I think this probably changed my direction because I was thinking of going on to study just ecology, and frankly, I got into the George Mason program because I already knew the faculty and I liked what they were doing, and I was just going to put up with the environmental policy and the other courses that we had to take just as the price of being in there to study biology. But I found that the economics, the environmental law, the business courses, and the public policy courses I had to take during that doctoral program have really served me better than the ecology courses I took later. Before I was finished with the PhD program at George Mason, my major professor got a new job at Utah State, and I went with him because I was very interested in ecological modeling. I knew he was the modeler at George Mason. I knew they weren't going to hire another mathematical modeler. So I ended up taking a little career switch and ending up in Utah State. That served me well because I learned more about mathematical modeling and developing models from my major professor than I probably would have had I stayed at George Mason. In fact, the research I did in my dissertation was looking at one of the foundational questions in ecology. Why are there so many different species, and why are they distributed as we see them? I wanted to test David Tillman's resource-based competition theory and see whether it held up in a disturbed system as well as the systems in which he looked at competition and found that his theory was able to predict the outcome of competition. You'll see this as a theme because my dissertation dealt with trying to get that one particular theory, or trying to test that theory to see whether or not it was robust enough to hold up under a non-equilibrium situation, nutrient pulses in a system of two competing phytoplankton. So that possibly harkened back to the Earth Day lecture I heard long ago. But after I graduated with my degree from Utah State, the job market had changed significantly in the field of ecology, and there were actually jobs for people outside of academia. So I decided to try to get a job with the federal government. I ended up getting a job at a USDA agency in their NEPA shop, where I was able to use my modeling skills to look at the impact of disturbances on systems. I took a not to exceed job, an NTE position, even though I wasn't sure I was going to be eventually taken up or hired by the government. I decided it was worth the risk to go ahead and work with this interdisciplinary group of scientists working on environmental impact statements, and possibly that experience would help lead to another job for me if I didn't get picked up by the government. But I only mention this in case any of you are considering a government career. It's always a good idea to go ahead and take that NTE job, because chances are it is going to lead to something. Once you get your foot in the door, you find out about other jobs, and it's much easier to stay than it is to break in the first time. I was on an interdisciplinary team primarily looking at risk assessments, doing non-target risk assessments and ecological risk assessments, when in 1994, Congress passed the Federal Crop Insurance Reform and Departmental Reorganization Act of 1994. This act created the office where I am now the director, the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost Benefit Analysis. The office has the mission of ensuring that proposed rules that regulate issues concerning the environment, public health, or human health, and human safety all have accompanying with them in the regulatory package a regulatory risk assessment that examines the degree to which the rule is going to be able to reduce the risk that it was designed to reduce. In addition, the rule is also supposed to, or the analysis is also supposed to look at a suite of alternatives to that rulemaking and determine to the degree to which those alternatives might also reduce the risk. I was invited to come down to the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost Benefit Analysis on a detail. And once I got there, I saw the wide range of federal regulations that were supported by risk assessments that I could review there. It was almost like opening a candy store for a kid. I remember how excited I was just being able to get a detail to come down to the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost Benefit Analysis. But once I got there and I started looking at the risk assessments, not only the ones that the Department of Agriculture did, but the ones that the other agencies were conducting, because of my modeling background, I could dig into the numbers and the models and see where the assumptions that they were making in the models may not have been consistent with what they were saying in the rule preamble, or possibly not consistent with what they were saying in the rule language itself. That intrigued me, and my former supervisor, my supervisor at my first agency, he was an attorney from the Council of Environmental Quality before he came over to our agency. He told me, you need to go to law school. So it was then in the middle of my career that I decided I was going to go to law school. So I went to George Mason School of Law at night for 4 years. They were 4 exciting and exhausting years because I was trying to do all of the work during the day at the risk assessment office and then go to law school at night. But I can say now, looking back on it, I've never felt more energized than I was at that point in time. After graduating from law school, I thought about whether I wanted to stay in the federal government. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, here I am in an administrative agency. Administrative law was my passion in law school, administrative law and regulation. And when you think about it, much of environmental law is administrative law. And there I had a front row seat to all of the new regulations that were coming out from other agencies. I just can't emphasize enough how exciting it is to see the new administrative regulations, the new regulations coming out. I mean, they're putting the bones on the statutes, which really don't tell you what to do and rely on the expertise of the people in the agencies. I feel like I have a unique opportunity where I sit to see not only USDA's regs, but the regs from other agencies and provide input at an early stage. But it's not always just providing the input on the regulations. My office has, as part of its mission, building capacity throughout USDA and the federal government for conducting risk assessments. I feel as though we end up getting involved in risk assessments and regulations that are involving risk at an early stage, even when it doesn't fit the actual statutes that would, or the actual regulations that would fall under our statute. Under our statute, we're really only obliged to look at the $100 million or more as measured in 1994 dollars. So that number just keeps getting bigger over time. We're only looking at the proposed rules that meet that level. I think through the other actions of my office, trying to build capacity and get involved in other risk assessment interagency activities, we're able to leverage what we are doing. And it also gives us entree into other regulations that are being proposed by other federal partners. I mean, there's really nothing more exciting than seeing a new regulation come to life. They asked us to talk about the joys of our job, and I guess that's one of the things that I find remarkable. But there are also challenges. Since our office was created, the number of regulatory risk assessments has declined. This is primarily because there are just not as many proposed rules coming through. A lot of the Farm Bill rules are already coming out hardwired from the Farm Bill to end up as interim rules, so they bypass my risk assessment requirement. And other agencies within USDA have gone through some type of regulatory streamlining back in the early 2000s that has caused them not to consider looking at every import on a case-by-case basis, but they came up with a regionalization rule where they look at imports in groups, and that has greatly reduced the number of regulatory risk assessments that we see. Nevertheless, my office is still very involved in looking at the economic analysis, the compliance with 12866, Executive Order 12866, and the other executive orders. There's really no shortage of work in my office. But as I said, I considered leaving the government, but I decided I had the front row seat to administrative lawmaking right before my very eyes. And what better place to see administrative law than from within an administrative agency? Another challenge that I face, and everybody in the federal government faces, is, of course, every 4 to 8 years you have a new administration, which is going to slightly modify your view of things. So you need to be flexible, but it also means you're going to see the same issues over and over again. So you can become very familiar on particular issues because you know you're going to see them many, many times throughout your career. It also takes a long time sometimes for the government to change. It takes a long time for an idea to catch fire and actually be taken up. For example, when I first started at the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost Benefit Analysis, while I was still on detail, I looked at the Conservation Reserve Program and their Environmental Benefits Index, the tool that they use to determine whether or not a particular property will be enrolled in the CRP or not. And it seemed to me that although they were taking into account wildlife habitat and in some cases threatened and endangered species, they didn't really have a specific practice that allowed you to look at increasing pollinator habitat. I invited a professor that I knew back at Utah State who was involved in the Agricultural Research Services B Lab to come out and talk about how to include the habitat for native pollinators in the CRP. We even came up with a habitat suitability index that we thought that they could slip right in there to use to evaluate the environmental benefit, or to help improve the environmental benefit index in its consideration of pollinator habitat. But that idea did not catch the first time it was presented, or the second, or the third. But I can say now, CRP does consider habitat for pollinators. So even though it takes some time, sometimes you can have a big impact just by seeding the ground with an idea that may not take life for quite a while. That's both a challenge and something that you can feel good about if it ever gets taken up. Well, I'm going to conclude by saying, I hope that you consider the federal government as you're trying to determine where your career path is going. If you are considering the federal government, I have some specific advice. I would, if I had it to do over again, the first thing I'd do if I was just getting out of law school or I'd been out for a year or so, I'd apply for a presidential management fellow. The application period for the 2021 applicants is September 30th to October 14th. It's a leadership development program that is really unrivaled in the federal government. They give you lots of hands-on experience, 160 hours of extra training in your leadership skills. You get a mentor. I mean, I can't say enough about the PMF program. You get to work with people at the highest level of your agency often, and it's a wonderful addition to your resume as you're trying to find a subsequent position. Another thing, if you're still in law school, I'd suggest an externship. You might need to contact the agency on your law school to set one up, but I know I had an extern for the University of Maryland. It was a great experience for me, and I think it was a great experience for the extern. Finally, if you're looking for jobs in USA Jobs and you want to have a career in the law, don't just concentrate on DOJ and the Office of General Counsel. Look beyond that. There are lots of other positions like attorney advisors. They're scattered throughout the agency. And I looked just last night, and there are 2 positions at the FAA for attorney advisors in environmental law. That is an under-recognized pathway for getting into the federal government and doing something with a law degree. Well, with that, I'm going to conclude. I wish you all luck in your careers. And remember, it's not just one career, it may be lots of careers that end up being molded together.
Thank you, Linda. We'll now turn to Lisa.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you to ELI for inviting me to speak. I am very honored to be speaking on this panel, and I'm looking forward to, I enjoyed Linda's presentation, looking forward to hearing from the other panelists as well. So I'm currently a 3rd-year associate in the corporate group at Akin Gump. We were previously called the Global Energy Transactions Practice, but recently merged with a larger corporate practice. However, my work still focuses on energy clients. I thought I'd begin by talking a little bit about my path to Akin Gump and pursuing a career in energy law. So my undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering, and even as an engineering student, I was taking technical electives like natural resource policy or a class called energy and the environment. And this was what really got me first interested in working in energy or environmental law. And I also had some engineering internships that were related to this industry. So I did a pollution prevention intern with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources one summer. And I also worked at a firm in Des Moines doing energy consulting. So we were working for energy companies in Iowa, but working with companies that were either retrofitting old buildings or building new buildings and helping them implement energy efficiency strategies in these buildings. And so that all really prompted me to go to law school. And so when I went there, I actually went to focus on energy and environmental law, which was in part why I chose to go to the University of Texas. So while I was in law school, I tried to prepare myself for a career in this field by taking relevant classes and participating in relevant, extracurriculars. So I took classes like oil and gas law, Texas wind law, and environmental law. And I also joined the Texas Environmental Law Journal my first year of law school and continue to serve on that journal throughout my time in law school. I wrote a student note on how Iowa and Nebraska could implement Texas strategies to increase their installed wind capacity. and also worked as a research assistant for professors and a practicing attorney who are updating their wind law treatise. So all this gave me kind of the educational foundation for going into energy law. And I also worked a wide variety of internships that really helped me figure out which area in particular I wanted to focus on. So I was in law school at the time when Texas firms would still let you split your summers between 2 different internships. So after my first year of law school, I started at the Iowa Attorney General's office in their environmental division. And this was my first introduction to doing state government work. I actually really enjoyed that experience. I got to do things like help draft a petition against an individual for some solid waste, air quality, and water quality violations. This was also at the time that the Waters of the U.S. rule had been released, and so one of my assignments was looking at a draft petition by the state of Nebraska against the EPA and recommending whether Iowa should join that lawsuit. And so after I spent my 6 weeks there, I then went to a litigation boutique in Austin where I did some energy or oil and gas work, but in general, mostly just did just a wide variety of litigation issues. It was after my second year of law school that I first went taking Gump to do corporate energy work. This was my first time doing transactional work, and I found that fit very well with my personality and my interests. And I spent the second half of that summer at a Texas firm doing environmental regulatory work. So I did things like attend meetings of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I compiled an audit disclosure that was sent to the EPA. And before I had done this internship, I really thought this was going to be the practice area for me. But while working that summer, I learned that that wasn't the case and it wasn't really a good fit. And so these wide variety of experiences were very helpful in figuring out what I liked and, even more importantly, what I didn't really like and what I was really looking for in my career. So after law school, I spent a year clerking. It was just something that I really wanted to do, and I'm really grateful that my firm was willing to encourage me to pursue a clerkship, even though I was planning to go into transactional law. So I clerked back in my home state of Iowa and didn't really see a lot of energy or environmental cases while I was there. During courts, just in general, tend to see a lot more of those cases. However, wind energy is pretty prevalent in Iowa, and so I got to work a little bit on a wind law case that had to do with the validity of permits for wind turbines, but otherwise I didn't focus too much on energy work while I was clerking. So about 2 years ago is when I started working at Akin Gump, and I mostly work on mergers and acquisitions and capital markets transactions for energy clients. So I have also worked for clients in some other industries. Being Houston-based, a lot of my clients are oil and gas clients. However, I have also worked on some wind and solar projects. And so actually the first big deal that I worked on when I started Akin Gump was a project finance deal for a wind farm out in West Texas. So I've had a wide variety of deals. Some examples of deals that I have recently worked on include exploration and production, or E&P companies in Colorado. I worked on the joint ownership agreement between 2 midstream companies that want to construct and operate a Coca-Cola pipeline together. And actually just recently closed a carve-out sale of a client's natural gas retail business subsidiary. So as a mid-level associate, my work on these kind of deals involves coordinating and working on diligence review, preparing disclosure schedules, and then drafting ancillary documents for the deals. So I work on things like board resolutions, various filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I also assist our clients with corporate governance matters, such as reviewing their annual reports and other filings with the SEC, reviewing their board committee charters, and just other various governance matters. An area of my practice that is particularly interesting to me, though it doesn't make up a huge part of my practice, is advising clients on environmental, social, and governance issues, or ESG matters. My work in this area involves helping clients prepare their sustainability reports, reviewing disclosures by our clients' peer companies to help figure out what other companies are disclosing in terms of metrics that they disclose, what their sustainability reports look like, and then also helping our clients understand and respond to different ESG ratings or rankings. And so, for example, one report ranks various companies on certain metrics, and one of our clients had fallen quite a bit in the rankings between the previous report and the current report. And so the client asked us to really look into the methodology underlying metrics, this reporting group at, try to figure out what they were looking at that was different than our client's disclosure, and then basically just trying to help our client understand why it had fallen in the ranking and how that related to the disclosures that our client was putting out. And so ESG is an area that is particularly interesting to me. As you can probably see from my background, I have a big interest in environmental work, even though I do energy work. And so this is kind of a very interesting way for me to work for energy clients, but also get to take a look at some of the environmental issues that these clients are addressing. And also ESG continues to be really important for a lot of our clients, in part because it's very important for investors. However, that is the extent of what I would say my environmental work is. There are environmental lawyers at the firm who specialize in this area. And so when I'm working on a merger and acquisition or a capital markets deal, these environmental lawyers are the ones who are doing the environmental diligence, who are actually helping draft the environmental representations that will be included in the transaction documents. Sometimes as a mid-level, I'll help coordinate the environmental lawyer's review of our documents. And so it's very helpful to have just kind of a background knowledge of some of the rules and regulations, but I do not spend a lot of my time diving into those regulations. That's something that our environmental specialists will do instead. So one of my favorite parts of doing energy transactional work is getting to work on really complex deals for really smart people. And that includes the partners and counsel that I work for at my firm and also the clients that I work for. I'm always learning something new. Every deal is different and presents new challenges. And so I'm constantly learning. Additionally, something that's really neat about working in energy law in Houston is that the energy industry is so important in the city. And so it's a great way for me to connect to a city that was not my original home. And then, as mentioned, I just really enjoy assisting clients with their ESG matters because it's an area that I'm personally interested in. So anytime I get to work on one of those projects, it's a good day for me. Some of the challenges I face in being at a big law firm include just a lot of the general challenges of working at a law firm. And so there are things like billable hour stress, unpredictable schedules. It was a bit of a change for me going from working for one judge to working for multiple partners and learning how to balance that. But that's definitely something that gets easier over time. And then an additional challenge to working specifically in the energy industry is that it's an industry that's very specialized. And so it was quite a challenge for me to come to Texas from Iowa with very little background knowledge on the oil and gas industry. So even with taking classes like oil and gas law, I still felt like I was a little bit behind the curve from some of my colleagues who might have grown up in Houston, hearing the terminology. They had family members who worked in the industry, or one of my colleagues had worked as an engineer at an oil and gas company for a while before going to law school. And so just having to deal with that learning curve. However, I overcame that challenge just by reading industry news reports whenever I have the time. I think it's really important to help introduce you to some of the major players in the industry and also just to get you familiar with the terminology. An additional piece of advice I have for learning how to deal with a very specialized industry is just making the effort to learn piece by piece. So for example, if there's an acronym or a phrase that's used in a meeting that I don't understand or that I haven't heard before, I take the time to Google it later, write it down. And then the next time that I come upon that phrase, I know what it means, and I can continue to focus on the bigger picture rather than getting bogged down with something that I don't know. An additional piece of advice that I have that relates to that is to realize and accept that you're not going to know everything, and there's a large learning curve, especially for new attorneys in an industry or practice area. The attorneys that you work for know that you're new at this, and they know that you're not going to know everything, and you'll learn things a lot more quickly than you realize. I additionally think it's very important to find a mentor or two, and it's especially important to find a mentor who you are comfortable approaching to ask for advice. I personally really lucked out because Akin Gump has a formal mentoring program, and the mentor who was assigned to me is the attorney I would have asked to be my mentor regardless. And his advice has been invaluable. When I can come to him and ask him questions about any challenges I'm facing, and I know that he'll tell me what I need to hear and not what I want to hear. And he also gives me very concrete action steps to take to address any challenges that I'm facing, which as a former engineer, it's very helpful to have something that's a little more black and white. And so his advice has been invaluable as I learn more about the practice of law. I also think in general, it's helpful to have a mentor who is outside of the firm or the office, just to have kind of an outside perspective and be able to offer that advice without any of the things like office politics or really knowing what's going on, being involved on a day-to-day basis. Additionally, I think it's important to be willing to take chances and try new things. So when I started law school, I certainly did not plan to be a big law corporate energy attorney. I remember some of my first year classmates would ask me if I want to do litigation or corporate work, and I had no idea what corporate work even meant. However, I really enjoy the people at Akin Gump. I find the work to be both challenging and really exciting, and I really enjoy getting to work for great clients. On the other hand, before I started law school, I really thought that I wanted to do environmental regulatory work. And while I think that I would possibly enjoy that from the government side, my summer experience doing environmental regulatory work at a firm, so doing it as private practice, showed me that that was not the kind of thing that was the right career path for me. And I'm really grateful that I was willing to take a different path because I've been much happier in my career than I think I would otherwise have been if I was pursued an environmental regulatory work at a private practice. And finally, I recommend taking classes or pursuing activities either in law school or professionally that are related to the areas of the law that you're interested in. This will give you a helpful background knowledge for working in the industry. I definitely wouldn't say that you should limit yourself to just those activities or classes. I think it's beneficial to have a wide variety of experiences and just to learn what is truly interesting to you, but it certainly helps to at least gain some knowledge, and basically that will also help you understand if that's really the correct career path for you. And so finally, to sum up, I think the energy and environmental law area is a great area of the law to practice in. The practice in the industry is always evolving and will continue to do so. So there are a lot of challenges for oil and gas companies in the current environment, which means that they're looking for new ways to innovate, ways to be more efficient. And so I'm excited to continue to work in this industry and see where it goes over the course of my career.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We will now turn to Marc.
Hello, I'm Marc Goncher. Can everyone hear me okay? Seeing nods. All right, so thank you to Environmental Law Institute for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's an honor to do so. And I'll just talk to you a little bit about my career path, which was, I've held, I guess, 4 different jobs since graduating law school. So maybe more similar to Linda in that regard. But in law school, I went to Emory Law School in Atlanta, Georgia. And at the time, I graduated in 2000. So I just had my 20th year anniversary of my law school graduation. But at the time, the school had started an environmental law clinic, and that was sort of towards the beginning, the early part of that sort of trend in creating environmental law clinics at law schools. And their law clinic was called the Turner Environmental Law Clinic, named after Ted Turner, who donated the money to endow the clinic. And there, I spent a year in that clinic, and including a summer, and participated in a really interesting project where we got to do a legal study of the Cumberland Island National Seashore, which is a unit of the National Park System on the southeasternmost barrier island in Georgia. relatively close to Jacksonville, Florida. And there, spent the summer working in Savannah as a summer associate for a law firm called Hunter McLean, Exley and Dunn. And half the summer being a regular summer associate, half the summer doing this clinic project where we drove down to the seashore and interviewed all the different stakeholders with interest in the management of that seashore. It's a seashore that had a wilderness area. Part of the seashore is designated a wilderness area. The rest was regulated as a seashore, but had a number of different layers to it, given the way the seashore was created. Descendants of the Carnegies and Rockefellers had donated or gotten the federal government to buy the island, and they sold their interest to different degrees in the. Hold on. Thank you. I'm giving candy by my 8-year-old. In any case, but I used the summer associate half of the summer to learn more about working at a law firm, and ended up getting an offer to work at Hunter McLean after law school. So I moved down to Savannah, working for and started work as a first-year associate there. A lot of the environmental work at that firm was focused on land use, a lot of wetland and marshland regulation and shore protection regulation, mixed in with business law. Although we did have a unique case there. Probably the most interesting matter that I worked on there was a toxic tort litigation matter where we were actually representing the plaintiffs in the case, 2 dairy farmers in Augusta that alleged that the consolidated government of the city and county of city of Augusta and Richmond County had misapplied sewage sludge to their farmlands, allegedly killing their dairy herds. So that was trying to get that case to the point where it could be get to trial was very interesting to work on as a young associate. But there I spent about 1.5 years at Hunter McLean, and but my future wife was in Atlanta, and so I moved back and started work at the state of Georgia Attorney General's office in the environmental section. That was really exciting as a young attorney because I was given really my own caseload to manage, and so I was managing the entirety of matters, not just little portions of research, and got to work on matters for the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Georgia Department of Agriculture. And it was also great because it was a team of, 6 environmental lawyers, of all more experienced than me. So I did a lot of learning, and was in my supervisor's office nonstop, asking tons and tons of questions. And so I had a good sort of mentor experience there that was invaluable for me. From there, after a few years at the AG's office, as a young attorney, I felt like I learned a lot, but I was looking for a more dynamic kind of way to develop as a young attorney and to grow. So I wheeled my ficus tree and my books across the street to the city of Atlanta, City Hall, where I saw sort of a dynamic municipal legal department headed up by the former general counsel for the United Parcel Service. And I did not know what she would grow into, but there I was hired by a young woman, only 1 year older than me, but far more accomplished even by that point, named Stacey Abrams. And so I worked there under Linda DeSantis and Stacy initially, working on all sorts of environmental matters for the water system, the sewer system, and other departments of the city that had environmental issues. I spent 12 years at the city, sort of growing and developing, luckily being promoted to different roles. Probably the most exciting part of that from environmental work that I did there was working on the city's 2 federal wastewater consent decrees. Like most major cities in the United States, it was under federal court order to overhaul its wastewater system to comply with the Clean Water Act. At the time, the projects were well underway by the time I joined the city, but there was a lot of trust that needed to be rebuilt between the city and the federal and state government. And I feel like I played a good role there, making some key presentations to the federal judge overseeing our consent decrees, and getting him to take some extraordinary action in the face of some of our neighboring, more suburban jurisdictions attempting to take parts of the drinking water and wastewater system without compensating the city of Atlanta. We prevented them from doing so. But also being a participant or having a front row seat to the tri-state water litigation between Alabama, Florida, and Georgia was incredibly interesting, and played a role as well in the conversion of the purchase and eventual conversion of a rock quarry to a raw water reservoir to make the city's drinking water system more resilient, as well as the development of the Atlanta Beltline, which is more or less a rails to trails project, but also a massive land development and park development project as well. After many years at the city, I was looking for something different, and a job opened up, and I applied and luckily was hired to go work for the Coca-Cola company, also in Atlanta, just 2 miles up the road from City Hall. So since August 2016, I've been working as the environmental counsel for the Coca-Cola company based in Atlanta, working in all different subject matter areas that you would think a large corporation like the Coca-Cola company would have. A lot of environmental health and safety management, some compliance and defense cases, get to work on ESG issues and review our business and sustainability reports and those types of communications that go out. Got introduced to a new subject matter area in environmental law that I wasn't previously familiar with, environmental marketing. Got to know the Federal Trade Commission's green guides very well, and also apply that to our annual sustainability report. And of course, environmental issues that come up in real estate transactions and M&A transactions as well. So the Coca-Cola company, the great thing about it is you get to combine kind of a job that focuses on environmental legal subject matter, but you also get to do kind of the big work on some of the big impactful sustainability projects that a global company can have great impact on. So that's sort of been my path from law firm to state government to local government back to corporate America. So hopefully that'll cover someone's interest in the class. I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Marc. And we will now turn things over, to Alejandra.
Hello.
Going back in my slide.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is an interesting format for all of us. So I think that this gives the opportunity. I think that if you have following further up questions, please feel free to contact me later on to have another discussion. So I just wanted to thank the Environmental Law Institute for this opportunity to present what I've been doing, my career path, and hopefully some of my recommendations will be useful to you. I've been working at Defenders of Wildlife for more than 10 years, almost 12 years. And we are a nonprofit organization working for the conservation of wildlife in the natural habitats. And what I've been doing mostly is work, as was presented, on international environmental, multilateral environmental agreements, and CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, the Convention on Migratory Species, CMS, and other regional agreements on tuna management and local and other species and bycatch species such as sharks. So what do I do mostly is advocacy work in international agreements. So the way that I I say it is exactly, I do the same thing that people, lobbyists, do in the Hill here in the United States, but I do that at the international level. So if you can imagine, for example, so United Nations level. So if you can imagine that you have all the countries parties to a convention get together, and they are trying to adopt international measures. And what I do as a nonprofit, as an observer, is that I try to advocate all of our conservation measures for them to adopt. So that is the fun part. I mean, some people like it. I mean, it has to be, you have to have your elevator speech, you have to be able to make contacts, you have to know what is your subject, your topic. But at the end of the day, I mean, what is the most satisfying is that your conservation measures, I mean, the conservation measures that you're trying to advocate are adopted. So that's the ultimate goal. So, and then we do follow up also to those measures that have been adopted. So to assist countries that we partner with for the implementation of those measures. So, and then I do a lot of work on the side, preparing all the important information, fact sheets for those meetings to be adopted. So there's a lot of advocacy work. There's a lot of preparing, reading documents, but also working with governments, which that is for me what has given me the most, what is my biggest interest. How did I get here? For me too, it has been a mix of academia, law firms, and nonprofit. And also a little bit of government work. So I have had also a big mix of that. I have a law degree from Mexico City. So the system that for me, it's a little bit different. So the system actually for us is that you go straight from college to the university. So from high school straight to university. So I didn't have that college experience. So it's interesting that you have to know already that you want to do law since out of high school. So and it's 5 years of law school, so it was different. And for me, what we always had as a students, I mean, is the most important is to get your experience in a law firm. So that was always for us, is like, well, you're studying to go and do your experience in a law firm. And I think that, and doing corporate work, which, I mean, that kind of like was the basis for us, and getting to know how a law firm works. And I think that was very important as to doing internships and that because I think it's important to know how is that world and if you like it or not. To me, I mean, I did it just almost as a requirement being in a law firm. I knew that was not my future, but when I knew what I wanted to do is when I wrote my dissertation to be able to defend it, to get my law degree, and I wrote about CITES, and I knew that if you need to do a big research, you have to do something that is of your passion and your interest. And to me, I got it. I mean, you always get like a little spark of what you want to do. And to me, it was, I was in the Sierra in Mexico, and I was visiting there for my spring break, and I just fell in love. I met somebody that was doing some community work and environmental work at a very local level, and I just fell in love of what the person was doing. And I just knew, I was like, well, then I want to do my dissertation about CITES. And then I decided to do, it's like, well, because my school, my law school, did not have really a lot of specialization in international environmental law. Nothing. Environmental law was like it was not something mandatory, so it's it's an optional. It was an optional course. So I did, so like, I wanted to really know more about it. So that's when I decided I needed to do an LLM, a master's degree. And that's when I came here to American University, and I was like, no, I really need to do something that I really like. And I think that that is very important, because that's where I got my really my passionate work and interest. And then I also got some experience to work in academia with a professor that I was helping with writing one of the international environmental law books. And that was also very helpful to get all the research and knowing and understanding all about international with multilateral environmental agreements, and getting like a foot of the interest. And I think, and to me also the most important thing was like, where should I go? And to me it was Washington, DC, because this is where the advocacy work is. I mean, you have all the think tanks, you have all the big NGOs. I mean, and like everything happens here. And also my biggest thing is that when I was doing my LLM, to be able to get my next job, I attended so many public like lectures or meetings. I mean, there's so much in DC where you can know it's just not only from the government, but from other NGOs, and that you can really understand what is the exact topic that you wanna continue doing. I got into a Baker Botts for a year for more practical training in environmental law. I think that was very important too, because same thing, I needed to understand how law firms here in the US work. I just knew that also I didn't want to do that, but I think it was also important. And then I just decided, like, for me, it was the NGO world. And the NGO world is amazing, it's fantastic. There's just some different sides. I mean, salaries, for example, are not at their best. And also you have to, if you're trying to look for a job in the NGO world, you have to also understand, or to ask, if for example, if your salary is going to come from a grant, or if it's just going to come from the general funds. Those are things that you have to ask yourself and know. But I think that the advocacy world, I mean, there's so much more, there's just so much more movement. I mean, the world is very small also. I mean, so that because the world is very small, it's very important that you go and attend whatever you can attend that is public. You have to make personal contact. A lot of informational interviews. I've received a lot of like students or people that just want to get into the world of like how to, because it's a very, very small world. I mean, especially international environmental law, and even more on wildlife trafficking. It's like, so I think that if you're interested in that, I mean, you just go to the universities. Also, the universities also have a lot of talks about that. So in Mexico also, my government experience was in the Environmental Enforcement Agency. And I think that was very interesting to know how the government works. And in Mexico, I was like, no, that's the same thing. I didn't want to do that. But it was very interesting. At the beginning, I was like, oh my God, this is what I really want to do, because that's where the implementation is on all these international decisions. And I was like, that's where the government is. But to me, I knew I didn't want to go that way. But anyway, so in terms of challenges for me, it was, well, I'm not a US lawyer. I decided I didn't want to pass the bar exam because I didn't want to do litigation. So I just knew, I mean, I'm being in the advocacy world. But in terms, yeah, I didn't very know that field, and also not knowing the path of other US colleges. So that to me, I was a little bit lost in that way, but that's why I just attended as many things that I could in terms of like as an LLM student. And what I really love about my job, as I said, it's just advocacy and just being able to prepare for those international fora in terms of like what is needed to happen, what needs to happen in the conservation of wildlife world. My recommendations is get a variety of experiences to be able for you to know what you want to do. And I think that it's very welcome. I mean, when we open positions, and then I see people that have a variety of like, you know, you can get that in internships, you can get that in externships, or just volunteer work, or however you can do. But to get like for them to know what has been to work in a law firm, for example, that's even though that was not their thing, it's very interesting. And also, if you're interested in a job, just prove to the employer that you're familiar with the subject and that you can learn more. I mean, that you're a little bit, so at least like, for example, for me, it has been very helpful when somebody comes and we're gonna be doing work on illegal wildlife trade, that if you have written a paper, for example, about that topic, perhaps you're not the expert on that, but at least that kind of like shows your interest, or that shows that you can research about. So that for example, for us, for me, it has been also very helpful. It's just prove that you're interested, like prove that you have attended, you know, presentations, that you have attended conferences, or that you have done something, and that you have, for example, written, it doesn't have to be a published paper, of course, but a paper, something like that. And just get as many internet informational interviews as you can. And anyway, and feel free to reach me too if you need anything. And I just want to say thank you again to the Environmental Law Institute, and thank you to the other panelists for being here.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and thank you for being here. We will now turn to Hannah.
I'm unmuted here. Hello, everyone. So as Caitlin mentioned, my name's Hannah Vizcarra, and I'm currently with Harvard Law School's Environmental and Energy Law program. But I've had a number of career transitions as well as some of the other panelists. And so I'll talk through a few of those. I graduated from law school in 2010. But that was not my first career. I started as a political campaigner. I worked in research and communications work in political campaigns for about 7 years. And during that time, I decided I wanted to go to law school, and I ended up at the evening program at Georgetown Law. So I was still working in campaigns while I did that. A similar experience to Linda, where, you know, that is a very challenging path, but it also can be a very rewarding path. I empathize with some of you who are likely dealing with this on this call, who are looking at our current environment and situation as far as the economy goes, because I got to have the wonderful experience of doing my on-campus interview week 3 weeks before Lehman Brothers collapsed. And, you know, that I think firms have learned a bit from that experience and have responded differently this time around than they did the first time. But what that meant for us was a good portion of my class ended up with offers revoked and very different summer plans, which of course impacted whether they could go into firms and other careers. It also had a pretty severe impact on public sector work as well, and who was competing for that work. So that's just to put out there that, you know, these are, you're going to go through a lot of different types of environments over the course of your career. You can still have a very wonderful, fruitful career, even if your first expected experience doesn't go as planned. Let's see. So I was an evening student, so I actually didn't do multiple summers of work. I had one chance, and that was it. I was lucky enough to end up still with a summer associate position, although the firms that I summered with told us up front that they were, while they were honoring the summer positions, they were not expecting to extend offers to more than about half the class that was there for the summer at the end of the summer, which is not typical. So fast forward, I did get a job. I ended up starting with Vincent & Elkins, and I was in the DC office. I spent about seven and a half years working in private practice with Vincent & Elkins, and then with Beveridge & Diamond, a smaller law firm. I did environmental law work the whole way through. However, unlike I expect many of you, I didn't actually go to law school with that specifically in mind. It was always an interest of mine. I worked in politics and had always been interested in those issues and when it came to policy. So I did take, and Georgetown has wonderful programs in that area, so I certainly did take a lot of those classes. I took admin law, environmental law, an international law class that touched quite a bit on environmental. In fact, I took admin law from a former EPA GC, because that's just what happens. As Linda mentioned, administrative law is environmental law. But I, and I did no environmental law work while I was a summer associate. There just weren't projects available at the time. My firm was very, as Lisa had mentioned with her work in Houston, Vincent & Elkins is a Houston-based firm, so a lot of their clientele is in the energy sector. So I did get quite a bit of exposure to energy and environmental law in that sense, even though I didn't do specific projects for the environmental section. But at the end of when I graduated and after I had accepted a position there, they did ask if I wanted to join the environmental law practice. And I had expressed interest in a mixture of litigation and regulatory work, which made that a perfect practice for me. And I didn't know how perfect a practice it was because I didn't really have a clue as a student what it meant to be an environmental lawyer in private practice. But, the nice thing and what you've heard from some of the other panelists about practicing environmental law and is that it covers a wide range of issues and topics, covers all industries. You get to do all the different types of lawyering skills when you're in a niche practice group like that. So those of you that are entering firms, I encourage you to try to take advantage of that. I actually remember sitting in your shoes at the ELI boot camp very vaguely about 10 years ago, and just being, even though I had taken environmental law and taken these other classes, having this experience to sort of to show what it means to actually practice in these areas and what is happening with the different statutes at any given time in the regulatory areas is amazing. It really does show you the breadth of the practice. I also very much enjoy being able to do both transactional work and litigation and compliance and regulatory counseling. And you learn a lot of different things and there are different skills that you get to apply in those different areas. Let's see, so big firm to small firm. I moved from Vincent & Elkins, where, a very large international firm with a environmental practice group that really was quite small. I think we were about 25 attorneys at the time across 3 different offices, to a much smaller firm, but one that focused entirely on environmental law. Beveridge & Diamond was a little over 100 attorneys. Most of them were in DC, although they have somewhere between 6 and 8 offices now. I don't actually remember that across the country. And there's some differences. And when you're looking at your career paths down the line and where you move, law firms there are distinctions between law firms, and there's advantages and disadvantages to different styles of firms. A smaller firm, I really enjoyed being in a smaller firm, but then at the same time, it really was in some ways much larger because the range of environmental work I could do was very different. It was a much broader range of clientele. You're working with different types of injuries and clients. Got to work more with public sector clients and cities and wastewater entities, things along those lines, and also do more hands-on litigation, which was one of the things I was seeking at the time. So at B&D, you have smaller teams, and there's not a litigation group to partner with, as there would be in a large law firm. So all the regular, litigation work that needs to be done for any environmental related matter, you're doing as as an environmental attorney. So you get different skills, but on the other hand, no due diligence, no big international deals. At Vincent & Elkins, I got to work on deals with facilities all over Latin America and things that would have wind, hydro, World Bank financing issues come up, a whole range of different types of environmental issues and different types of regulatory issues you'd have to look at. So those are just a few distinctions. I'm happy to talk more about that during the question and answer time. And as apparently is becoming my habit in my career, 7 years went by and I decided to make a change. So 7 years in political research, about 7 years in private practice, and I ended up at Harvard Law School's Environmental and Energy Law program. We are not a clinic. We're actually a research program at the law school. There's another wonderful environmental law clinic at Harvard called the Emmett Environmental Law Clinic. And so we're more like a think tank. All our work is public facing. It's allowed me to take a step back and really think about environmental law and policy issues from a broader perspective, from sort of rule of law, statutory development, and analysis, and beyond the confines of what the needs of a particular client are or a particular industry. My work includes everything from, so we track and analyze regulatory changes under this administration, and I help manage our regulatory rollback tracker, which is one way we're providing public information on that. We also go beyond just sort of the rules themselves and look at what's happening within agencies and how sort of the workings of the government are shifting under different administrations. I also manage a portfolio on private sector approaches on climate and environmental issues. A lot of that work involves, or has so far involved, diving into climate
Point actually for the compounding methodology change. So the flat. Do you have a resource, maybe like a reader friendly?
You all hear me now? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I think my router just kicked me off. Not exactly sure where you all lost me, but this is one of those hazards of working from home. So I think hopefully you heard about the climate risk disclosure work. And I was about to say that in addition to that, I'm also managing developing work around legal dilemmas with sea level rise and things like property law and how cities are responding. And I also get to continue to focus on energy regulatory issues, particularly related to exploration and production, which I had developed an expertise in from my past experience, as well as actually, as Lisa mentioned about colleagues who have grown up in different places. I grew up in Houston, so I was very much surrounded by that throughout my life and didn't realize how much I did absorb until later. Let's see, what else should I mention to you all? I get to, analyze the sort of challenges that the private sector is facing in responding to climate change and legal and regulatory issues involved, how they turn their commitments and aspirations into actionable policies, and identify sort of near-term progress that can be made within existing legal frameworks, as well as, sort of the more academic work of thinking beyond existing legal frameworks. I think one of the things I really like about this role is it does a good job of marrying the practical with the aspirational. We're not professors. We're not sort of judged on our ability to think on whether we're thinking well beyond existing law. We're more practical, application oriented, which all of us come out of different career paths, but with that in mind. So we're focused on what we can do to analyze existing law and improve environmental progress. I would just say, your career is a journey. I definitely did not see myself in this particular position. But at the same time, I also can't really see myself doing this particular position in the way I am without the experience I've had before. So it was a bit of luck. It wasn't what I was specifically looking for at the time. And it was the right people that were there to recognize that it was a good match. But be open to those things as you evolve. I'm able to bring an understanding from private practice of how regulated entities work and think about problems, how environmental litigation works, environmental issues that are considered in transactions, some technical understanding of industries that, a different path wouldn't have provided for me. And it allows me to look at the issues that I'm analyzing in a different way. Let's see, what else? I would also just mention and sort of emphasize something that you may have pulled out of some of the other panelists' comments as well, which is environmental law really is an interdisciplinary area. I'm spending a lot of time diving into the history of securities law right now, and while I had very limited exposure to that as a private practice attorney, reviewing risk disclosures and things like that, I'm getting a much broader understanding of it. It's not necessarily something that you would think in law school that is part of the environmental law world, but it's increasingly so. And it's just one example of the ways that environmental law is, is becoming sort of an essential part of every attorney's practice in different ways, or at least has an impact on their practice. I very much have enjoyed that aspect of this practice area. Also, one of the wonderful things that was somewhat of a surprise to me when I started working at ELP is my work with students. I never saw myself as going into academia specifically, so I hadn't pursued that type of role and wasn't looking to teach. And I don't teach, really, I don't have a class, but I love working with students. We hire students as research assistants, and they are huge contributors to our program and our output and what we're really able to get out into the world. And it's fun. It's kind of like working with summer associates, at least that's the way I treat it. And I've always enjoyed that kind of engagement with people developing their careers and learning about new areas of law for the first time. And also, I think Lisa may have mentioned, getting involved outside of your workspace and with other professionals and in other areas. I would encourage you to do that, and both with attorneys in your practice area, but also outside of attorneys. I've been involved with the Women's Council on Energy and Environment for a number of years, and it's a DC-based organization, but not just with DC members. And it's been a good way for me to meet people outside of work who work in energy and environmental issues, but aren't necessarily lawyers. There's a lot of consultants, a lot of government folks who do more technical work, a whole range of experiences, folks in the corporate world. And personally, that's given me new perspectives and contacts that have helped my career as well. And then of course, there's always ELI, who, as I mentioned, it's been a part of my career since I started at the ELI boot camp, which is something that my firm sent all the new environmental attorneys to. And of course, things like ABA as well. So I would encourage you also to do that. I'm happy to talk about any of my varying different roles and paths and the decisions I made about, why I moved from one thing to another when we move on to question and answers. But I will pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Anna, and we'll now move to Alexandra. I think you may be muted. We cannot hear you now.
A month, 2 months, and it said
No. Thought it worked.
Now we can. We can hear you now.
Andy, we could hear you there just for a minute, but we're not hearing you anymore.
It looks like she's switching to the phone.
Oh, thank you.
Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry about the delay there. Joys of this new working from home environment. I'm Andy Wyatt, Alexandra Wyatt. I'm Policy and Regulatory Manager with Grid Alternatives, which is an equity-focused renewable energy and green jobs nonprofit. Among other things, it's the country's largest nonprofit solar installer. And I'm very, very glad to be here. Thanks to ELI for having me. It's an honor. And thanks to everyone who's still on. Hopefully I'm not catching everyone's post-lunch slump, but I'll try to keep things moving because I know we'd like to get to Q&A. I want to start by saying if there's one piece of career advice I hope I can leave folks with today in recognition of just like everything that's going on right now, it's that if you're on an environmental law or policy track, you're also on a racial justice track. Our kind of dominant culture likes to pretend that you can separate these issues, but trying to address environmental issues without addressing racial and economic equity and justice is like trying to lift one side of a cube while keeping the other side still. It doesn't make things easier, it makes things impossible. So I'm very lucky, I consider myself extremely lucky to work at a place that tries to recognize and prioritize that connection. And I think a lot of environmental organizations and businesses are slowly getting better about that as well, but I don't think there's any sphere where racial justice doesn't belong, and for white folks like myself, where there's anywhere where we shouldn't be taking on some of the burden of speaking up and lifting the perspectives of other folks. So I just want to say getting more comfortable with those issues isn't just a nice thing to do. I think it's going to be an increasingly important career skill in the environmental sphere and others, whether you're in the private sector, public sector, or public interest sector. So, and I myself have had the privilege of being in all three of those. So now I'll talk a little bit about my experiences and how my career trajectory has gotten a bit more focused on policy over time. So from the beginning, I'm one of those people who didn't just like fall into environmental law. I specifically wanted to be an environmental legal and policy advocate with a science background, at least my college years, if not before. And so I sort of arranged my education around that goal. After getting a law degree and a master's in environmental science and policy and doing the environmental law clinic at my law school, I started out at Beveridge and Diamond. Hi, Hannah. And I did a lot there, worked on both litigation and regulatory matters. I worked in a lot of different subject matter areas, but over time I had an increasing focus on chemicals regulation. And I'd echo a lot of what Hannah said about different kinds of firms, although I only got to experience the one size of firm firsthand. But I did get really excellent practical experience and training at the law firm. One kind of unique example of that was I had the opportunity for a secondment or kind of a part-time assignment to actually work inside the in-house legal department of a client, which was a really great and interesting win-win-win opportunity for me and the client and the firm. And I got a lot of really interesting business perspective from that experience over the course of about a year and a half without having to actually go through the hassle of changing jobs. But as good as things at B&D were, I did change jobs. I realized after about 7 years there that I still wanted to explore more, and I was particularly interested in public service. I landed in what I think turned out to be one of the most interesting little corners of the federal government, the Congressional Research Service, which where I was sort of an environmental law generalist, serving legislators and staff, mostly staff of all parties, both chambers, on basically any environmental law topic that came up. So if you're, really into the interdisciplinary angle more than a particular environmental law topic, I think you can't go broader than working in a legislative branch, whether at federal, state, or local level. I did continue my chemical regulatory focus and was involved in some pretty major chemicals legislation, probably the biggest environmental statute overhaul since 1990. I was involved in the congressional response to the beginnings of the Flint water crisis, which is still ongoing, by the way, the crisis. I don't know about the congressional response. I analyzed the Clean Power Plan and the litigation over it, federal lands, endangered species, energy development, environmental justice, air, water, Superfund sites, basically anything that Congress was working on. It was great. And so the skill of sifting through enormous amounts of information and learning things quickly really came in handy, and I honed that because I basically had to relay other people's expertise, since it's really difficult to be a subject matter expert on so many different subject matters at once, especially with, again, all of the interdisciplinary crossover with even things like constitutional law. And so it was great to be able to work with different colleagues on those intersections. It was really very intellectually exciting, always topical and relevant sort of by definition. But I did, start looking around for another role. One thing that prompted me to do that was that working at CRS demanded absolute neutrality on policy questions. Basically, like neutrality between being pro-environment and not so pro-environment. But as you can probably guess, I'm pretty opinionated and pro-environment, and I didn't, get into environmental law just because I was interested in the topic in the abstract. I am interested in protecting the environment, which I think is a perspective shared by a lot of people. So I did transition to a new role. In my current role, I get to advocate for a just transition to clean, renewable energy, and that suits me quite nicely, and I am always thrilled to be able to have that as my day job. Grid Alternatives, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit that works to put solar power and solar jobs and related technologies like energy storage and electric vehicles and things like that, basically where they're needed most and where they might not otherwise get to, with a focus on frontline and disadvantaged communities and low and moderate income households. So Grid has offices all across California, in Colorado, and in the Mid-Atlantic, in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, as well as a tribal program and an international program. So my role at Grid is primarily as a policy advocate, not primarily as an attorney, although I do some legal work for them as well on occasion. And despite my experience just in Congress at the federal level, most of my advocacy is at the state level, where a lot of energy policy and regulation happens, as well as a lot of incentive programs around clean energy access. Although definitely when I say federal support for renewable energy is also really essential, especially right now with the macroeconomic conditions and everything. So I do track and increasingly get involved with that as well. So on a day-to-day basis, I do things like help propose and establish and shape new programs, definitely try to defend and expand existing programs that Grid Alternatives works with to do its training and installation work. I submit comments and testimony on rules and proceedings. And I work with coalitions and community-based organizations that are out there to build momentum for policies that enable more equitable access to solar and clean jobs. So a lot of that definitely involves relationship building. Basically, I try to make things easier for my colleagues who are out there on rooftops and in fields installing solar arrays, which they do at no cost to Grid's clients, and they're out there training other folks in the communities where Grid works how to install solar too, to kind of keep the cycle going. So Washington, D.C., where Grid has the Mid-Atlantic office where I'm based, is really lucky to have a great Solar for All statute. And so that uses funds from DC's Renewable Portfolio Standard to provide the benefits of solar to the low and moderate income folks in the districts and cut their energy bills in half. And so those are the sorts of policies that I try to amplify elsewhere, and certainly in DC to try to optimize and streamline in different ways. DC has pretty high levels of energy burdens. Energy burden is sort of how much you pay on your energy utilities as a percentage of income. So that kind of savings in people's pockets can help them avoid being displaced out of the city. And so there's a whole lot of crossover there, again, with things that people consider more social issues that are nevertheless very much in the heart of kind of what the energy transition and climate action is going to look like. It was also really exciting to be a part of Virginia's huge leap forward on clean energy that was enacted earlier this year, the Virginia Clean Economy Act and related legislation. There's a solar freedom bill and a new community solar law for folks who are unfamiliar. Community solar is where it's not on your own rooftop, but you can basically subscribe to panels and it's treated like counted towards your own energy. So, and those new laws include some provisions that we fought for to make sure that lower and moderate income Virginians can get clean energy too, without all of the hurdles and barriers that can keep people from having access to that. So I have to say my legal background really helps me in my current role, even though it's mainly a non-legal role. And I do think that, you know, especially things being what they are, being open to as many possibilities as you can, whether they're legal or not, could be a way to really expand your circle of opportunities. You know, I'm the only JD in the organization, and obviously the background with advocacy helps with that a lot, of course, but it also helps me kind of connect the dots between the words of a legislation or a regulation or a program description and what that's really going to mean for people in the real world. I think I can stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions either now in the Q&A if we want to shift to that, or if anyone wants to reach out to me afterward. I am also very happy to connect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we do have a good amount of questions in here, but again, folks, if you have questions, please enter them through GoTo's question box, and we will get to as many as we can with our great panelists today. So I will ask our panelists to keep your responses to our questions a little bit on the shorter side so we can get through a bunch of them. But of course, we look forward to what you have to say. So the first question that I've pulled up here is one of our participants asks that, of course, this will vary for each participant or panelist, but they are interested in hearing about the role of paralegals in any of your practices or former practices. And for those of us not interested in law school from this participant, do you find that paralegal roles are still a meaningful way to affect environmental change? So maybe Lisa, if you have any experience and want to comment on that, and then if anybody else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I can try to address that. A lot of my work with the paralegals has to do with more of the corporate governance side, and so We have some paralegals at the firm who are a huge help when we are filing documents with the Secretary of State's office. I haven't personally used them for environmental issues just because it's not the area I focus in, but they do play a large role in helping us get our deals done and serve our clients. But I can't speak to the environmental change aspect.
I could speak to this as well. So when I paralegals were critical to the work I did in private practice and were very much a part of our teams. And I think it really does, if you are pursuing a paralegal path, it really does vary firm to firm, sort of what that role is and how integrated it is into the work. When I was at Beveridge and Diamond, I can think of a few examples of paralegals. They were specifically assigned to litigation teams, and so we're a part of everything that we did, involved in all the strategic meetings on our litigation, and so I would say had a really active role in in understanding the facts of the case, in working with clients, in pursuing our different tactics and strategy and for those cases, and helping us gather and develop our the sort of legal background to that, and so there are firms that really do value and elevate the role of paralegals and teams, and allow you to develop expertise in particular areas and work with specific practice groups. And there are other firms that and I can't specifically speak to every different experiences, but that's not necessarily the case in every firm. It may be a little bit more of there may not be as much opportunity to sort of specialize in a particular practice area or not, or you may have to span multiple practice areas, and so developing that kind of expertise could be a bit harder. So it's something to think about and look out for if you're pursuing a paralegal path. To make sure to talk to other paralegals who have worked in those firms and understand what role they play and how well they're integrated into the management of matters.
Great, thank you so much. We will now move to another question. One of our participants wrote that some of these environmental problems seem so grand and so monumental. How do you keep your goals manageable, realistic, and objectively checkable in regards to your work?
I will start this one. So actually that's great, because actually our goals in the international arena are pretty bold and large, and actually not always you have a good result. I mean, there's a lot, because there's so many things that depend on, which are politics, the momentum, and others. But I think that for us, I think it's very important to have a bold goal, and if you don't achieve it that year, you will achieve it. You will achieve it at a certain time. I mean, just to give a specific example, we have been trying to work on getting a ban on the retention of short fin makos and the ICAT. So that's the International Conservation Commission for the Atlantic Tuna. And mako sharks, short fin mako sharks, especially at the North Atlantic, are doing really bad. I mean, their population is really plummeting, and therefore we have been asking countries to do to adopt a ban on retention. And it's been a couple of years where scientists have said and have proven that the population of North Atlantic shortfin makos are plummeting, and countries year after year, some of them is just very specific, just say that they don't want to adopt that policy measure. And so we will know that we just know how to work on the next year and next year. So that brings an interesting challenge, but we'll know that one day we'll be able to adopt such a measure. And we know that one day that they will be able to listen to the scientists' recommendations. But I think that it's very important to set up that that important and high goal. Otherwise, I mean, if you just go for the small measures, I mean, sometimes they're just not as meaningful at the international level. So just that's on my side.
This is Marc. I think when you're looking at broad issues that impact all of society, and many of which impact society on a global scale, I think from the corporate perspective, you have to look at what impact does your organization have on those issues, and what is a measurable way to lessen or reduce or eliminate that impact. I think for a company like Coca-Cola, around the early 2000s, the issue was water. And I think the company set some measurable goals to try and reduce its impact on water usage and scarcity around the world. It looked to conserve water in its industrial processes. It came up with a way to measure its water usage impact and to, quote, give back every drop it uses in the production of beverage back to nature and communities in different ways. And by 2015, by its measure, it had achieved the goal of returning a drop of water for everyone that it uses. There's some big limitations to that claim, but we didn't go all the way up our agricultural supply chain to look at what water is being used there. But still, it was a measurable way to do some good in the space of water. Now, I think the beverage industry, like other consumer packaged good companies, are getting criticized, and there's a lot of focus around plastic waste. And so again, you've seen goals being set by different companies in the United States and around the world around reducing plastic waste and its impact on nature and communities. So, Coca-Cola is not unique in this regard, but it set goals, collection goals to collect a bottle or can for everyone that it produces. It set goals for recycled content in its packaging, and it set goals for itself to work with partners to develop new ways to reduce plastic waste. And most of those goals are set for either 2025 or 2030. But that's one way, is just to do what you can and set measurable goals with realistic deadlines.
I would just add one comment, which is that, as lawyers, you are constantly having to balance sort of large change with small measurable actions. And I think one thing that you get through legal training of any sort, whether it's sort of going the paralegal route, just the work in that area versus law school, and that I think we could all apply to different roles, whether they're legal roles or not, is sort of the real impact that small changes can have on it through existing frameworks while working towards larger changes. And so I think it is important to remember that all of those things contribute and contribute in different ways and build on each other. So that's one way to kind of keep focused a bit while aiming for larger change, but maybe making significant progress with smaller actions.
Thank you so much. I think we have a quicker question for Linda. One of our participants asks, what percentage of your job is lawyer versus scientist? Would you rather it be a different way?
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer, actually, because I see them as being mixed together in most of what I do. I mean, I'm supposed to be looking at the risk assessments, which certainly falls on my scientific expertise, but then also looking at the regulatory text language, which I would think relies on my lawyering. I think that my job is 50-50.
That's perfect. Thank you. This is a question for all of the panelists and whichever, whoever wants to engage in the question. If any of you have any recommendations for how incoming first-year law students can and should engage with potential employers and mentors, especially given the likelihood of online or various learning systems come fall.
This is Lisa. I can start this one off. Oh, sorry. I think the important thing is just to make those connections. I know it's likely going to be a lot harder as we continue to stay online and continue to work from home. But I think people are always glad to have you reach out to them, especially if it's a career path you're interested in, someone you want to mentor you. I think it's important that we all stay as connected as possible, and people are going to understand that you're working from home, that the situation is very different. So I think just being willing to reach out as much as possible and start building those connections in any way you can, even if it's just a small email or phone call at first. Eventually, hopefully, we'll be back to a more, I guess, a pre-pandemic situation where you'll be able to meet in person and build those connections face-to-face. But I think it's just important to start the process as soon as you can.
Some of those professional organizations may help with that as well. So whether it's Women's Council on Energy Environment, ABA, other ELI, whoever you want to get involved with, I think all of them are trying to foster different ways of connecting, whether through virtual happy hours or whatever, that help not replace, but at least approximate some of the more sort of happenstance meetings and interactions that help you then follow up with a phone call or an email to develop relationships. So I'd look out for that as well.
Thank you both. We have a question for Lisa. Can you speak to how the skills and information that you learned in your clerkship translated to your current work?
Yeah, so I think the most useful thing that I took from clerking into my current practice is just having that introduction to the overall practice of law. So a lot of the cases I was actually working on don't really touch at all on my practice, in part because I was looking at Iowa law, whereas now I work with a lot of Texas federal law. But I think just having a general foundation of different legal issues and learning, especially for me, being able to see the litigation side, even though I'm a transactional lawyer. And so I didn't touch on a lot of contract cases, but I did have some. And so it was important for me to learn how important clear drafting is to avoid later litigation. And I think just basically the main takeaway from clerking for me was just really understanding the general legal scheme outside of just my individual practice area.
Thank you. We have a question for Alejandra and for Linda both. So one of our participants is a South American student who's just graduated from her LLM here in the US, and she is hoping to pursue a career in the environmental field, either at an NGO or as a federal employee, and is hoping that either of you can provide some insight to that, whether it's working from your LLM or in federal government as a non-traditional US employee.
So I think that, I don't want to respond from Linda, but I just know that because that was my position. I know actually that's why I started with an NGO too, because I didn't have the citizenship back then, and actually you cannot work for the government if you're not a US citizen. So I think that's how I started, because to me there were not that many options. I wanted to go for the government, but I just couldn't. So I started with the NGO world, and I just stayed because that's where I liked it. And I am pretty satisfied there. So, but as an LLM, a foreign, that's great, and I really, that's great that you're doing that. And there's the OPT possibility to do when you're a foreign student, and I think that was very important to take that opportunity. And for employers, actually, it is, I think, a little bit easier. That's how I started at Baker Botts and a law firm, because it's just a 1-year program as a foreign student, and that is very good, because then the employers don't feel compelled to keep you forever and ever. It's just like a 1-year position. And I think that if you want to go for the NGO world, you have to ask yourself, what kind of NGO would you like to go to? If you want to do a large NGOs and small NGOs, they both have their pros and cons. If you're in a large NGO, you're going to be able to go to different fields or different programs. You're going to be able to do the opportunity. If you go to a small NGO with the topics that you would like to, they also has its benefits, because then you have a more personal attention to what you're doing. So I think that you have to try to figure out what kind of NGO world you would like to. If it's national, if they have programs for the international, if they have international programs. So those are also questions you would like to ask yourself. And just try, as a foreign student, is, as I'm saying, it's contacts. A lot of teachers, especially in LLM, in doing international environmental law, they work a lot also for NGOs. Also the way that I started is that my teachers had already an NGO too, so they were they could guide you, and they could help you really on which NGOs or where to go. So I think that is very important. That also you could talk to your teachers to introduce you.
Hi. As a general rule, you do have to be a U.S. citizen, especially to hold a permanent federal position. But there are cases where you don't need to be a federal citizen, where you don't need the citizenship just to have a term appointment or a fellowship. I'm thinking specifically, unfortunately, I can't think of anything in the legal world that fits with this, but there may be something. I'm thinking of something like an ORACBA fellow at FDA and at NIOSH. I believe they have these. I know they have them at FDA, and people from outside of the United States who aren't citizens can serve in those functions. I know a fellow from France who was at FDA for 2 years in one of those positions. And I believe my co-author on a nanotech article was from the UK, and he had one of those positions at NIOSH. I don't know if there's similar positions like that for lawyers. There may be. I don't know. I've never looked into it. But sometimes temporary, not to exceed fellowship type positions do get you a little bit of federal experience.
Thank you both so much. We have a question more geared towards Andy and Marc, and that is, how do you both see environmental law impacting communities, particularly marginalized groups, through your work?
I'll start. I think the impacts are very numerous and very intertwined. Even in the current pandemic situation, the communities that are getting hardest hit, partly there's economic causes, but partly it's air pollution exacerbating, underlying health impacts. So the impacts of environmental law on marginalized communities are very many. And so the good thing about that, I guess, if you will, is that there's no shortage of places to just start and make a change of something for the better. And so I think, the more in my role where I see myself having an impact is expanding the benefits of clean energy to communities that can benefit from the energy savings, from the resilience benefits, and all the other benefits, the cleaner air, most directly, but they may not have the capital or the credit scores to be able to go solar on their own without some of these incentive programs that I advocate for, or other ways that policy really shapes how how people and the energy system interact. So yeah, that's I guess just a long-winded way of saying I see nothing but connections between environmental law and how that impacts the communities where we work.
From at least in my current role at the Coca-Cola company, I'm mostly focused on making sure our claims are accurate and legally supportable. But the work behind that, and that we have sound policies, I suppose. But the work behind that is where Coca-Cola probably has a positive impact on marginalized communities. The water work that I was talking about, part of giving back to nature and communities is making sure, this is mostly overseas, but making sure communities have access to clean water for basic sanitation and health. In the United States, it's probably more geared towards restoring watersheds and ecosystems, and giving back water that way. Companies like ours have human rights policies to make sure that we're treating people in no matter what country we operate in with a basic level of human rights. We have economic empowerment programs. Most famous, Coca-Cola participates in the 5x20 program to economically empower women in marginalized or poor communities in Africa and Asia. And the goal was to economically empower 5 million women by the end of 2020. Things like that. I guess more U.S. focused. It's, we have a long way to go on plastic waste, but I guess one example would be, the company right here in Atlanta funding something called a litter getter. And so it's just a low-tech contraption that's placed in the stream. They work with the local riverkeeper organization in a watershed called Proctor Creek, which is most of which would be considered a marginalized community here in Atlanta, and just pulling litter out of the creek, making the creek more scenic and livable, and where otherwise that litter would head straight into the communities of predominantly African American communities of lower income.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one more quick question, and we'll try and have each of our panelists give a quick snapshot of what they think in response to this. So the question is, what are the fastest growing areas of environmental law, and what are some growing areas that are not as well known in your experience?
I might just take this 1 minute response. I'm going to take it also from the international perspective, and the most growing part is, of course, it's wildlife trafficking, so illegal wildlife trade, and that it has been growing, but now actually the combination of it is combined with health, human health. So right now we have wildlife trade combining with human health, and that's going to be pretty interesting for the next few years.
I guess I could just mention that with, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go, Hannah. I'll pass you.
I was just going to say, so in my current role, it's hard to choose a particular area, but I will say something I mentioned before, which is that the sort of expansion beyond sort of traditional air, water, waste as environmental law or chemicals regulation as environmental law, which are all very much still core environmental law work. But beyond that to sort of your corporate and business law and other areas is increasingly important. So understanding whether you practice directly in those areas or, just understanding the breadth of your impact if you get involved with those. I also would mention, or just go back actually kind of to the last question, that issues of community resilience, community engagement in environmental legal issues are increasingly prevalent and always important, but are becoming more and more part of day-to-day work in many different areas. And the way that's being expressed in my particular work is some of the legal issues that we're choosing to focus on. We're specifically taking a look at, how communities are engaged with those policymaking and decision-making processes, with the regulatory development. My sea level rise work is developing in that regard. We just put out a community resilience piece with a student who's been focused on that, who will be our legal fellow next year, as well as focusing on things like the intersection of health and environment. So working across disciplines, working with experts in other areas of the larger university in order to amplify the impact of the work we do analyzing regulations and legal policy by putting some real connections to what it means for public health is increasingly important. So I think sort of that interdisciplinary aspect of legal work in the environmental space will just continue to be incredibly important.
I can tell you from our standpoint, what I see on the federal side is being one of the fastest growing areas is sustainability, matters involving sustainability and food waste. Of course, maybe I'm seeing that because I'm in USDA, but food waste seems to be a big problem that's beginning to get a lot of attention. On the other side, what is not as well known that might be increasing, of course, I'm at agriculture, so I'm going to say the Food Safety Modernization Act and its intersection with environmental law, because I think there are a lot of aspects of at least the requirements for growing produce and some of the other standards that overlap with environmental law and reducing runoff.
From our corporate client side, a lot of what I'm seeing has to do with the focus on the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance issues. We see a lot more of our clients who have not previously been publishing sustainability reports who are starting to publish that, in part just because I think all these issues are becoming a lot more at the forefront, and a lot of the investors, whether that's institutional investors or individuals, I think people in general are just really starting to ask corporations what they're doing in terms of the environment, in terms of sustainability. And I expect to see even more of a focus on that continuing to go forward. I think there's talk about the SEC potentially requiring some of that disclosure in the reports that companies have to file. So I think that's something that's going to continue to be a big focus, and definitely not going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you all so much. I'm afraid that we are out of time today, so a big thank you to our participants for joining us and for your many thoughtful questions. We hope you'll continue to think about the many opportunities and facets of careers in this field. We are grateful for your participation in ELI's annual summer school series, and we do hope to welcome you all back for NEPA, ESA, and the fundamentals of environmental law next Tuesday. I want to extend a thank you to our fantastic panel, Linda, Lisa, Marc, Alejandra, Hannah, and Andy. You have all contributed so much. Thank you for lending your leadership to summer school. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.